I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Welcome to Race Unwrapped, a podcast unwrapping all the ways race affects our world, whether we're thinking about it or not. This season, we're talking about race and comedy and how people of color in America use humor to help us navigate in a majority white society. Cracking a joke is one of my favorite go-to tactics. No matter how different black folks are, we know how jokes are a good way to create bonds, talk real about the tough topics, and find some light in our darkest hours. Just listen to this bit from comedian Roy Woods Jr.
Black folks been trying to tell y'all forever that they had some issues, and we invented the blues. What more of a sign did you need? We literally invented an entire genre of music based on sadness. That's how sad the blues was created here. That is an American art form. That is not native African. You go listen to old African music. The shit is happy because we was free. Come on. Every old African song, freedom in Africa, freedom, freedom, freedom. As soon as we got off the slave ship, boom, 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 boom.
Dr. Lawrence Edwin Williams joins us on this episode to take a closer look at humor and tragedy. He's studied how humor can help us process the difficulty of talking about race and living with racism. And he's a black professor, so he has plenty of personal observations on the topic as well. This is Race Unwrapped. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson, and my guest this episode is Dr. Lawrence Edwin Williams. He's an associate professor of marketing at the Leeds School of Business at the University of Colorado. He received his PhD in psychology from Yale, and I gotta say, this brother has all his degrees from Harvard and Yale. One of his research topics was how people clowned on Hurricane Sandy when it was predicted by the weather experts, and comparing how people joked about it after the hurricane hit versus before. It helped that someone created a Twitter account from the perspective of the hurricane, and that gave researchers a fun way to track the relationship between the timing of humor and tragedy.
I am a psychologist by training, and I work as a marketing professor. So I study consumer psychology and teach at a business school. I study basically how people's feelings influence their choices, how the world around us, what's going on around us in the environment shapes what we want or what we're likely to do. I have studied humor a little bit with one of my colleagues who has published extensively on humor. I tend to be a little bit more interested in some of the social implications of humor, and I have a background looking at how feelings of psychological distance shape how much we care about things in the environment. And that plays into our ability to find things funny.
So what got you interested in humor, that psychological aspect?
Yeah, it's one, it's just so important. I think that, growing up, you learn about the world and your place in the world through what you find funny or the people around you who have a similar sense of humor. So it's always been one of those things that, connects us, and I've been interested in the things that connect people to each other and give us a sense of purpose. But that particular study that you referenced, some of that was just see what I was around at the time. So I have a colleague who was really interested in this work that I was doing about threat reduction, and how if you interject a sense of distancing or a sense of unreality into a situation, you can make it feel less threatening. And one of the things that happens is then it's easier for you to cope with that, or to, in my studies, you can make decisions that have a little bit less of an emotional quality to them. So just be a little bit less bothered by the sort of the threatening aspects of making a choice, and maybe approach it a little bit more rationally. And my friend, or my colleague, who's a friend now, he was interested in trying to figure out, well, like what makes things funny, and he thought that that distancing might be particularly important. So we started collaborating on some work, and indeed, what we found was that distancing does matter. It can help the really scary things in the world feel like more suitable, sort of like targets for humor, like something you can make fun of if you can detach yourself from it a little bit.
You researched how people used humor in the wake of Hurricane Sandy. First of all, when was Hurricane Sandy?
That was in 2012.
What made that the tragedy, and I'm using the word in your study, what made that the tragedy that you decided to research in terms of what role humor plays?
Oh my gosh. Well, a lot of it was just the circumstances around it because it was one of those storms where it got a lot of press coverage in advance. So hurricane season, there are things that will go from the Caribbean and then like hit Florida, and there are all these hurricane watches. And this was one that we were watching, you know, from the Atlantic, like in the Caribbean, and then like up the coast, and then had these expectations that it would hit New York. So it was just in the news a ton. And we benefited from the fact that there were people who were making jokes about the hurricane on Twitter. And you know, Twitter is it's a certain thing now, but at the time it was, you know, like a newer technology, and it was like a bit unusual to find joke accounts. Not as, you know, unusual now, but at the time there was this joke account that was posting tweets from the perspective of the hurricane.
Oh, I love those.
Right. Right. Yeah, it was just like, you know, just spouting nonsense and just like talking about all this destruction that it was going to cause, and all these ways that it was going to like one of was like I just like crashed into a Starbucks and now I'm a pumpkin spice hurricane. It was just like very silly, but like that was on our radar, and since we had this theory about like why and how distance might matter, like we were thinking that, you know, like because it's not real yet, it's easy to find humor in it. But then like once it becomes real, like if it actually causes the devastation that they predicted it would, then no one's going to joke about it because you're dealing with the tragedy, so to speak. But then we also like had the sense of like, you know, well, time's going to pass and we're going to like move away from it. And as we move away from it collectively, then these jokes about it that weren't funny at the time should become funnier over time. And so we were just kind of like looking at that, like, when is it going to be like stop being funny? When might it become funny again? When will it stop being funny again? Because like too much time has passed.
Right.
And it was just, you know, just kind of like a happy coincidence that we were able to use that event where it's like everyone knew about it, so we can get our research participants, and there are people making fun of it, so we didn't have to like come up with jokes ourselves, which would have been terrible.
Right.
To rely on someone else's ability to crack jokes. So it's just like one of those like all the stars align to allow us to kind of like test a hypothesis in real time.
You know, as I was reading the study, it made sense as I was reading it, as I was mentally sort of comparing it to, you know, the topic at hand, which is race and humor, right? Because the thing about a natural disaster, especially something specific about a hurricane, is it's this specific tragedy, right? With you know, as you said, you know, it was projected, so there was enough time for there to be like a parody account up before anything actually happened. So it gave you something concrete over almost a concrete period of time to trace. Whereas, you know, when I think about race and humor, it's a similar thing, only it's wider and more amorphous, right? We only joke about race from 1928 to, you know, 1954. Like there's always something in American society that involves race that has all these different perspectives. Like, for example, I want to, because we're on radio, nobody can see you. We've established that you're a professor and a researcher, but, because I've seen your photo, I know that you're a Black man, right?
That is true. Yes.
So I was wondering, in addition to studying all of this as a professor and as a researcher, what was your personal thought? Did you have any personal thoughts about how Black people have used humor in comedy, particularly Black people? Because, you're Black, I'm Black, so, it's probably harder to, to think about what another race might think of how they use comedy. But did you think about that at all?
Not in my research, but, as a Black person, for sure, it's, I think comedy is just central to the Black experience in America. And I think it goes hand in hand with this idea that there's a lot of tragedy to draw on. So, comedians will say that comedy is tragedy. The recipe for comedy is tragedy plus time. And for, I think, a lot of Black comedians, especially in the 20th century, you are trying to find the humor in, very tragic situations. So I think it's easier to find humor in the fact of slavery 100 years later than it is at the time.
Right.
I think it's easier to find humor in the fact of Jim Crow 50 years later compared to being in it, directly in it. But even at the time, Black comedians and just voices in the Black community are motivated to find something in this that is mirthful, not to justify it, but just to get by with it, or to make a broader point. Sometimes you think of Dick Gregory, he's using humor to showcase the absurdity of how people relate to each other in this country. And you have Richard Pryor, I think uses humor very effectively to just show how so much of Black people's lived experience in America is just fundamentally nonsense. And totally inconsistent. It doesn't make sense given the sort of the story of America that we grow up with. So, I think that you can point to celebrity comedians in the Black community, but also I think it's just part of the some of the core Black experience.
Ain't it though?
Yeah, it's hard to say because obviously there's no one single Black experience. People, they're born into different situations. They come at it from a different perspective. They experience their Blackness in their own way. I don't want to take anything away from how people show up in the world, but it's been my experience, I would say, that you use humor to cope with this life that we sort of find ourselves in this country, and also to connect with each other who have a similar history to draw upon.
And so I know what you were trying to say, in that basically, to keep it real, not all Black people are alike. We all come from different walks of life. But I'm going to say this because I can and I will. But except for super bougie Blacks, pretty much Black people as a group, regardless of whether we're talking, from somebody from the streets or somebody, who's paving the streets, or who has the street named after them, Black folks, we just, I think, in the midst of tragedy, can find some of the craziest things to crack a joke about. Even
that's been my experience for sure.
Right. And it's especially, when it's just us or the accepted white people, like the white, daughter-in-law has been around so long that she doesn't think twice about it being a Black, Black humor is just family humor, right? Are your friends? I mean, I know my friends have become very acclimated to my very Black humor, and I think that my white friends are better for it, frankly. But anyway, I digress. But
it's an important point. So if I can jump in on that, so I have two reactions, and again, some of it's a little bit research based, but a lot of it is just personal experience. So The more I think that we can find a way to appreciate each other's humor, like it just feels like that's the path towards meaningful inclusivity and like belongingness. So I very much think that that there's like humor that is for us as a community, but it's when you let it out, it brings people in a way that I think is useful ultimately. Like it provides that like common ground. Because some of it is just like people haven't like thought about the world in the way that Black people have, and we've thought about the world in a certain way because we've had to, because of especially just the way that we get treated in America historically and now in the present. But then there's also this like element of like, I think that there is a certain form of like mirth and a certain form of joy that you find in the Black community, and when you let it out, it's like, you know, almost like a gift that you give the rest of the world, and it gives us like common ground to sort of like find a way to relate to each other.
I agree, both, like you said, both internally and externally. Yeah, in your study, there's a line that really jumped out at me that says, humor requires threat, but not too much or too little.
That's right.
So since racism is a threat, there's probably correlation between benign threat and life-threatening threat. You know, for example, you know, most Black people who worked in a big company, and my Asian brothers and sisters, my Latino brothers and sisters, my Native American brothers and sisters have had that same experience of folks can't keep you straight. Like, you know, if there are 5 Black women in a place that has, 300 employees, you're always being called by the other one. Black men, y'all know it too, right?
Yep.
So that's a benign threat. I mean, it's irritating, it's annoying, but it's a benign threat, as opposed to you're stopped by a police officer and they're mistaking you for somebody who there is an alert out about. So, and suddenly that mistaken identity becomes a threatening threat. What are your thoughts on that in terms of when there's a point you can joke about that?
Yeah, so that's for me, like I think that's the whole thing, that it's like the sort of severity of the situation, but it's also like how much distance can you put between yourself and the situation. And you can do that like through, just the passage of time. So like thinking about getting pulled over, like there are plenty of Black comedians nowadays who have really harrowing stories about encounters with police that they're able to mine that for comedy and bring that into their art. But I would imagine that they're not going to tell those jokes right after those events happen. Like I think you need to get, like you need to know that you're safe, and you need to like feel the support of your community, and you need to like do the emotional coping before you can get the humor out. But then there are these other things where I think almost like it's doing like microaggressions. Like,
oh yeah,
if you can find a way to find the humor in those, like you're gonna feel better. Like that's going to help you cope. It's not that you have to like get over the microaggression before you can find it to be funny, so to speak.
Right, and I've found that microaggressions are almost how you get to teaching people about bigotry, because because like everybody can relate, for example, to a boss who just clearly doesn't like them. like there is no warmth in their voice when they speak to you and say good morning versus the other 8 people that they may pass, and this on a level you cannot prove. And so people, everybody in your workplace can joke because it's like, oh, well, he went to K-State. He doesn't like you because you're a Jayhawk. You know what I mean? But, everybody can relate to that. But then once you maybe point out, no, he's that way with me. I'm the only Black person. He's real warm when he talks to you white people that he passes. Then people start getting uncomfortable. You know what I mean? Same truth, different attribution.
I totally agree. I think like sometimes people take it as a challenge, and sometimes people take it as just like a fact of life of even in those things, there's power in finding the humor in the situation, right? But it's just kind of like the timing matters, or like the space or the sense of safety. Like it really matters when the joke is going to hit as a like, like that really made my day versus like, oh, that actually made me feel worse about this situation than I did before.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to racism versus race, because I think those are two different things, right? Like, race may be joking about your hair or something that's, different than your coworkers. But then there's racism. What's your personal thought on, because it seems like there are some things in our community that like will never be subject of joking. Like, I live here in Louisville, Kentucky, which is where Breonna Taylor was, where she lived and where she was killed. And I don't, ever see there being a point where that's something for people to joke about.
Yeah. So it's a hard question. Let me see, because I have some feelings about it. My first feeling is I like to think that because of just like all of human experience and all of the sort of like tragedy, the things that don't make sense, just like all of those sources of heartache that are available to us, I'd like to think that we can find a way to like find humor in everything. But I do think that there's something really important and meaningful about, are you joking at someone's expense and a specific person especially, or are you like finding humor in a situation, again, like highlighting the absurdity of it? So like with Breonna Taylor, I don't live in Louisville, so maybe it's just like the physical space that allows me to have this thought, and like you please check me on it. But like I would say, like with that situation, it's a very tragic situation, and it makes every aspect of our policing system seem like absolutely foolish.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So if I were a comedian and I'm trying to make a point about the absurdity of policing in the United States, I think that case and all of the details of that case are super important and relevant to highlight as just like, can you believe this? Like, this is complete and utter foolishness, right?
Yeah, no.
And I can never imagine a situation where you're going to take the life and the loss of life of Breonna Taylor herself and crack a joke about it.
Right. I totally get the distinction. That's really interesting.
Yeah, so it's a little bit, like, this is why I think not everyone like can connect with each other through humor. Like why like some people try to learn how to be funny. There's an element of really like you have to like have a point of view that brings people in, that draws people in. I think that's like the connective piece of humor is such an important piece. And if you're making like light of people's lived experiences, if you're making jokes at people's expense, like I like you, like I have so much difficulty imagining that truly being funny to people.
Right.
But I will say, just like the scientist in me, like is like, but I do know that there are people in the world, like on the white nationalist side, who I'm sure there are plenty of people who have made jokes about that situation at Breonna Taylor's expense.
Right.
And for whatever reason, whatever it is in them, they have something that allows them to find some humor in it.
Right, because there's nothing sacred. If you're a white supremacist, there's nothing sacred about the life of Breonna Taylor.
Yeah, you can't have any more like social distance from the life of someone like Breonna Taylor, the life of someone who looks like Breonna Taylor, like if you are a white supremacist or a white nationalist, right? So that's the ultimate sort of like distancing, and then like being able to find humor in like a situation that at its core, on its merits, is completely tragic.
Right. One of the things that I think is particularly of interest about racial humor, like obviously I've only been Black all my life, but I have friends from other ethnic backgrounds, and like there's this rhythm this rhythm and there's this language to how people talk, right? There's nothing funnier than seeing, for example, a friend of mine who's Mexican American talking on the phone with her family, and I can't understand a word they're saying, but the laughter and the rhythm there's just something so visceral and beautiful about it. That's different than if I'm joking with my family, where the whole syntax and the way I talk may change.
Yeah.
Like one of my favorite jokes when somebody says something really like, "Can you believe blah 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 happened?" And I'm like, "Well, as the old folks say, well," I mean, it's cultural, which is why it's like the joke. We're laughing together.
Yeah.
So psychological distance seems to be a big part of what you're studying. Is there ever any real psychological distance that, like, can a Jewish person have psychological distance in joking about the Holocaust?
I mean, and in my experience, yes, I've seen that, I've heard that. I think that it's a time thing. It could be like a generational thing. Um, like the point that you made about humor, sort of like it's part of a culture. Like it shows up in a way that links people to each other in their culture. I think that that's really, really important. But then we have within each culture, we have like subcultures, right? So
Yes.
you can have like in the Black community, I've seen like humor directed at younger Black people who have like customs and styles and like ways of approaching the world that are just so different from what older generations experience, and then they like find a way to joke about it. And then like you have young Black people who make jokes about the way that older people are, like, and this is just like part. And then when you get them both together, like a barbershop or something, and it all comes out, and it's like, and then all of the jokes like riffing back and forth are part of what keeps us all together, right?
Yes.
So I have seen that in other cultures and other contexts as well.
It's funny that you mentioned the barbershop, because I'm sure that, like me, some of the funniest things you've heard in your life have been in a barbershop, or in my case, a beautician's chair. And what is it, do you think, about Black people and getting their hair did that makes them just like, and I've seen how class gets thrown out the window. Like people who you would never see like talking and joking together outside of the beauty shop are like all up in it with each other. Why is it so funny that, Black people can, pun intended, let our hair down in barbershops and beauty shops when it comes to jokes and humor and comedy?
Oh, yes. Yeah, I think that the ton it says a lot. So I love that humor because it's really a sign of psychological safety, right? So I think that we've carved out only a handful of spaces in public where we feel that we can truly be ourselves. I think that's true for our community. I think it's probably true for a number of communities of people of color in this country. And for whatever reason, that when you're in the barbershop that you're not going to, like be judged for what you say or how you say it, that you can, like speak about the things that you found to be especially ridiculous, or that you can highlight how these experiences like align with our shared values, or like speak to like a certain truth or a certain wisdom, something that a lot of people in those spaces can connect with. So I think that is like the safety, and then there's like the shared cultural knowledge that comes out in those spaces. And I think the fact that it's public, it enhances it in a way, because otherwise we would, like only be with our family, like be in our houses, sort of like be sheltered. But when you're at the salon, or when you're at the barbershop, you're, like you're in the world and you're being the most authentic version of yourself.
Oh man, I love that. That's a beautiful way of thinking about it. I guess I sort of psychologically sort of knew that, but I had never thought of it that way. And it makes me think about how politicians are so busy running to Black churches. The places you need to run to are the barbershops and the beauty shops, because that's where you really gonna catch a cross section of us.
Exactly. If you want to know what people really think, yeah,
Right. Right.
You got to get them where they're going to let you know.
I mean, here's the problem, though. The church people will be nice when the politicians leave. After you leave a beauty shop or a barber shop, you know that we gonna crack on your ass. Well, so, but that's a political discussion in and of itself. It's helpful, right? You know.
It is. I mean, I think that you really do want to. I don't know. Like, I'm not a politician, but my sense is if you're trying to understand someone, if you want to help them, really, like, you have to know what they think, and you have to give them the space to be able and willing to give it to you. And a lot of times we use humor as a way to make the truth more palatable, more acceptable, right?
Yes.
So you know, like, and again, like, our, like, you know, comedic, like, Black comedian heroes have been legends at taking very hard truths about the world or about our country or about people, and packaging it in a way that people can really digest it, and then start to see, like, oh, like, I don't want to be that person that, like, Dick Gregory is talking about, or that Eddie Murphy is talking about, Richard Pryor is talking about. Like, I want to be, like, you know, part of the solution. I don't want to be this problem that they're, like, you know, highlighting through their humor or through their comedy.
That was Dr. Lawrence Edwin Williams, an associate professor at the University of Colorado's Business School. This season, we're exploring how comedy can help us unpack race and racism. On our next episode, we'll meet Ann Libera, a comedy professor and founder of the Comedy Studies program at Columbia University in Chicago. We'll talk about the anatomy of comedy. I'm Michelle Tyreen Johnson. Thanks for listening to Race Unwrapped.
Race Unwrapped is produced by Michelle Tyreen Johnson for Louisville Public Media. Our senior producer is Laura Ellis. Audio engineering by Eric Matthews and me, Alex Biscardi. Music by Allison Cross. For more information, to contact us, or to support Race Unwrapped, visit lpm.org/raceunwrapped.
Support for LPM podcasts comes from the Eye Care Institute and Butchertown Clinical Trials, where they strive for diversity, equity, and inclusion within their staff, patients, and clinical trial participants. To learn more, visit butchertown.clinic.